Okay, welcome back, everyone. Ask for your attention. It's my privilege to reintroduce Tim Yoon, our Inman professor. And you heard his bio yesterday, so I'm not going to go through the bio in detail, but one of the really nice things about having an Inman professor, if it hasn't dawned on everybody, is this is somebody who graduated from our program. So for those of you in training, residents and students, you can project this is where you might be in the future. He was sitting where you are at one point in time. So who is he? Who is Tim Yoon? And I just wanted to point out a few things about him. He's a professor at Emory. He is chair of the Spine Center operations. So leadership skills and accomplishments that have happened since residency. He's director of clinical research. He was chief of orthopedics at the VA for about a decade. He has an MD, PhD. He was a member of the medical scientist training program. So some of you are in that role as well. He's a founder, a creator. He helped found the Korean American Spine Society. And he's a PI. He's a funded investigator. So amazing, well-rounded combination of many things. And he started out in the seats where you guys are. So Tim, welcome back, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to build a successful academic career rather than practice career. So one word change from the title. These are my conflict of interest. I have some financial interests in spine companies, but I don't think they're going to affect this talk today. We're going to start with three words: what, why, and how. So, what is academic medicine? And I think I'll show you today that it's probably more than you think, and more of you are doing it than you think you are, and why you might want to do this. And then we'll talk about how to do this to be successful. So here we go. So if you go to the internet and start looking for, academicians, academic personnel, it gives kind of a one-dimensional answer of what it is to be in academics, Basically that you're at an academic institution. And, the location of where you work, I don't think determines whether you're an academic person or not. You could be at an Emory University or some other university location and be academic or not be academic, or you could be at Rush, where I trained, where it was a private practice model that was very academic. So I don't think it matters exactly where you are. So it's both yes and no. I think a better definition of what it means to be an academician is whether you're involved in these three activities, any of these three activities. One is knowledge dissemination. Are you a teacher? Are you involved in some sort of a teaching process? The second would be knowledge generation. Are you creating any new knowledge, research? And then leadership and service, I think, also qualifies under academics, because you're providing the environment for people to do those two top things, teach and create knowledge. And so this could be involvement in societies, governmental or non-governmental, FDA, these kinds of things. So what I'm trying to say is that, there's a broader definition of being an academic than you might think. And also, I think what you're looking at by being an academician is that you might have a greater impact than you can treating one patient at a time, right? You can touch more people's lives by being an academician. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's a spectrum. It's not a binary yes or no, you're in academics or you're not in academics. I believe that there's truly a spectrum, and it's the degree of which you're doing academic enterprise. So now let's talk a little bit about the whys. And I think, teaching is a calling for many, many people. And I think it's intrinsic to the human being. There's an inborn need or desire to teach people and learn. And that's, I think, how our species came to be where we are right now. And it's a very ancient calling. In terms of research, what we're trying to do here is advance the field, create new knowledge. And this could be in many, many different things, whether it's in basic science, clinical research, product development, creating a new surgery. I mean, there could be so many different things, right? But as long as you're moving the ball forward, I think that counts, right? And then leadership. There are some people that have an intrinsic, desire or need to want to partake in leadership, to make the world a better place, better organized, to reshape it into a better institution. And of course, there are many ways to do this, whether it's at your home institution or in societies or global health outreach. And I think the act of providing that leadership, providing that environment, I think is an academic enterprise that many people are called to. And then perhaps you're interested in going into academics because there's the big center with the ICU, so you can do the bigger cases. You might have partners that share in your love of knowledge and that you can bounce ideas off. And so what it really means is that there's a dedication to more than the clinical practice, right? So now let's switch to the hows. How? And I'm going to introduce the idea of the BHAG. Many of you already know this. Role models. And I'm going to draw a lot from my personal experience to share with you because, there's so many different articles already on how to become successful as an academician. And then I want to close my talk talking about AI and the potential that this poses, both positive and negative, and talk about this thing called Moloch. And I'll introduce that to you in a little bit. And a call to action. Okay. So I really believe that you should try to have an intentional life rather than an accidental life. Instead of leading your life in some random fashion, I think it's so much better to have a vision of what you want to accomplish. It doesn't have to be immediately, detailed vision, but you need to have some kind of vision of what you want to do. And from that come goals. And then that intentionality develops so you can head toward that direction that you want to go, towards fulfilling your vision, right? So as you try to set your goals, I think it's really important to think about the roles that you play as a person, you as a spouse, as a parent, as a child to your parents, as a teacher, as a friend, as a surgeon, as a colleague. And setting these goals should be within the context of these roles, and you should have goals within each of these roles. And when I started my practice, I remember I took the summer right before I started my first job. I got this book, Franklin Covey, and it was very popular back then. It may not be so popular at the moment. And I remember that I'd heard that at UC Davis, Mike Chapman, who was the chairman at the time, said that he was greatly affected by it, and it just changed his life. So I gave it a shot, but I got the skinnier version. It was just a planner, but it had this great set of things to work on. And it talked about, setting these career goals and personal goals and things like that. And I thought it was really useful, and I would advise people to do that as well. So when you set career goals, it could be anything. I want to make a mark. I want to be a great, clinician. I want to be a president of a society. But you should also set the family goals like we talked about. I think it's also very useful to dream big when setting goals. When I look back on my life and career, I think I should have dream big right from the beginning. There are moments in your life when you're not sure that you can accomplish these things, but it's okay. Because by dreaming big, you can have a long-lasting, meaningful, motivating set of goals that you can work towards. And it can be, a guiding light for you. So Jim Collins has this wonderful book that I read many years ago, And it introduced the idea of the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG, right? So the BHAG, as Kennedy said, was you choose to go to the moon in this decade because it's hard, not because it's easy, right? The big, hairy, audacious goal. So it should be a clear and compelling goal that organizes your thoughts and energies and creates priorities. And what I mean by priorities is you really need to prioritize. That means some things are important and some things are not important. Because if everything is important, then nothing is important. Okay, so what is your BHAG? I think you should ask yourself that question. And this is going to be individual for each person, obviously. And it's going to be something that is not just a dream, because a dream is not something that you can actually, take action on. I think that goals, the BHAG, should have deadlines and processes. So it should be like this. You have your BHAG. So for example, let's say I want to run a marathon in under 4 hours, right? In 2 years. So there are two things here. There's a goal and a time, a deadline attached to it. And I think that's important. And then you got to create process goals that are specific, achievable, and under your control. The outcome, the stuff above, whether you want to run that marathon under 4 hours, may or may not happen. It might be really hot that day. You might have an injury. Who knows? There's so many different things that could get between you and that outcome. But I think what you can control are the processes, the intermediate goals that are actionable and under your control. So for example, I wanted to run a marathon one day. I said, I never run in my life, but I'm going to do this thing because it sounds really fun and exciting. But of course, it led to failure. I had no idea how to train for these things. And I got injured, I got setbacks and all these things. But I started talking to people and to try create a community of people that I could share this activity with, right? Other runners, and I started reading and talked to some coaches and started a long run running group with some of my partners on Saturday morning. And, and you sign up for races together. And this community is what really helps you to kind of get to your goal. And then remember, try to set a realistic goal, a high goal, but something that is actually achievable, like within the limits of the time constraints that you have as a busy surgeon or busy research person or whoever that is, right? And so I'm glad to say that this kind of goal setting to run a marathon has led to a surprising journey where I was actually able to accomplish a lot more than I thought I could ever do, including finishing a full Ironman contest. And also, during that process, it really kind of whittles you down to the core of what you need to do and eliminate all the useless stuff. Like, for instance, we got rid of TV in our household and, just so many things to just streamline our life. And then I think when you do this, you can get closer to the best you. Okay, so a little bit about time management and systems. I think that clinical practice can be that bottomless pit. It can just consume you. It's so easy. It's fun. I love surgery. You love taking care of patients. That's why you went into this thing. But it can truly be a bottomless pit. So you need to kind of control that. And I think the way that what's successful for me was to actually set aside a scheduled time to do these kinds of activities and assigning time slots, research time meetings that are regularly on the schedule instead of these ad hoc meetings, and having an academic day or some time where you can do this. So I'm going to skip some of these things, but I think there's some lovely time management books and systems out there, and I encourage you to look at that. Now let's talk about teaching. There are, you got to think about students and forums. So who are potential students? Ranging from high school students, college students, medical students, residents, other attendings, international scholars, I don't know, but you got to think about all the different potentials and see where you might fit into that equation. and think about the forum, the location in which that you might be doing this kind of activity, and really try to see where you mesh, with what your situation is and what your interests are. And I think the other thing that I'd like to do is encourage you to think a little deeper about teaching, right? So I think one-on-one teaching is great. I love doing that. But can you do something that has more impact, right? Because that's what we want to do, is have more impact. So it may be with curriculum development, or in my particular example, I was really interested in teaching methodologies. So, we brainstormed on how can we teach our residents and fellows how to repair dural tears. So we came up with a sheepskin condom model where you put fluid in there and you can practice closing durotomies. And so here we've come up with a way of hopefully advancing the field of teaching, right? So clinical research, everyone loves to do this. I think it's very natural for us to do. But don't be discouraged. So for many of you out there, you don't have to do an RCT, multi-center, to get out. You can start with a registry like the American Spine Registry, of which I'm a member of, or you can enter your data into global data. You can start just keep tracking your outcomes, and then you can start using that information to mine and track how you're doing. I think it's important for you to build your team. There's an African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together, right? So as you build your team, you have to understand that as a clinician, you're going to be providing the clinical input. What's important? What's the important question? What are some of the things that limits the solution space so that you can focus your team on how to do this? And gather the people that you need to solve the problem. Is it a methodologist? Is it a scientist? Is it an engineer? And you're going to find out, and you're going to build that team, and you're going to do much better research. So now let's talk a little bit about the possibility of doing basic research, and I'm going to give some of my examples of basic research. The why for me was that I wanted to bring modern biology, especially molecular biology research, into orthopedics, because I thought that was a great need at that time, about 2.5 decades ago, right? And so the next question should be, why me? What do I have in specific that gives me an advantage to study this? Why should I be the one to study this? And for me, the answer was, first of all, I was interested in it. Number one, it's a big deal. And number two, I had a PhD in immunology. Granted, it's not in orthopedic, field, but at least I knew how to do molecular biology research. So I came to UCSF in 1994. And Dr. Bradford was the chairman at the time. And, he's old school, right? He grew up in a different era. But I was just amazed at how interested he was in fostering basic research, and he talked about, he asked me to go into the lab 1 day a week to do research during my residency, even though I was not in the one-year the research program. And and Serena and Jeff Lotz were all there at the time, and they were great inspirations for me. And when I did my fellowship at Rush, these two guys, a clinician scientist, they were great role models for me in pursuing this kind of basic science research. So when I went to look for a job, I had that in the back of my mind, and I thought, what are the ingredients that are going to be necessary for me to be successful in this kind of a career? And so, I asked when I interviewed for 1.5 days of research, because it looked like everybody I spoke to who had 1 day of research said, well, I use it for makeup clinic, I use it for, add-on case, and it just didn't seem like they were able to accomplish as much academic work as they really wanted to. And I knew the kind of research that I needed to do had to have some animal facilities and some sort of, startup. So I went to places where they had these kinds of things and also had a track record of doing basic research for job interviews at the time. So each of you might have different circumstances, but that's just kind of how I did this thing. So what was my BHAG? It was to cure disc degeneration in 10 years. So the goal plus the time, right? And so I tried many different things, and I'll tell you some of the journey of what I tried, okay? As a young, eager surgeon, I wanted to just take a shot, right, at it. And basically it was a shot in the dark, right, to try to treat disc degeneration. But luckily for me, I had in mind the training that I had at a basic science lab where you should always be looking to try to gain some mechanistic knowledge while you're taking that shot in the dark. So we first tried proteins, but disc degeneration is a chronic process. So I thought, what we need is to do gene therapy so it would have a longer lasting effect. So this was my first Issels Prize, formerly known as the Volvo Prize that I won. And it basically shows that you can stimulate disc cells to produce more proteoglycans if you treat it with LMP1 in a viral vector. And that works through a BMP-mediated process. So that's what we found. Really cool. But then the Jesse Gelsinger story came out. You might know about that, where there was a trial at Pittsburgh when gene therapy went bad and the patient died. And I came to realize that if we ever wanted to make this kind of thing a reality, it can't be gene therapy for a non-fatal disease like low back pain and disc degeneration. So then I switched tracks and looked for something else, and I found a peptide, a small peptide, 12 amino acid fragment of the link protein. And link protein is important in cartilage. And it turns out that 12 amino acid, which is much, much smaller than the proteins we've been working with before, can actually stimulate disc cells, and it wasn't osteogenic, it was much more chondrogenic. And then it was really cool. That was my second Issels Prize. And then we went on to try to understand how it works. And to do this, I had to team up with a protein scientist and an endocrinologist who knew a lot about how to do this kind of molecular research. And together, that team was able to identify that this worked through the extracellular domain of BMP protein. This small thing would bind to that and basically act like a BMP protein, even though it was much, much smaller. So the idea behind why I wanted to do that was I wanted something small, easy to synthesize, that you could repeatedly use or do drug discovery using that molecule. And so there was some rationale for why we're doing this. At that time also, I was the deputy editor for the Spine Journal for the basic science side. And the kind of papers that I saw were very repetitive, shots in the dark, no mechanism, no rationale for why they're trying this, that, and the other thing. So I would really recommend that when you're doing a project, think about why should you do this project instead of just like, I got this interesting thing and I want to just try it. So in the next phase of my work on disc degeneration, I decided that what you really want was something that was completely non-invasive, because the data came out that putting a needle into the disc causes disc degeneration, even though it might be for delivering therapeutics. So then I worked on electrical stimulations, and we found that you can actually stimulate BMPs using electrical stimulations, and that could lead to more extracellular matrix. And so that was really fun to work on. And the other things that you might think about is model development. At the time, we had really bad models, but I was able to show that rabbits have disc degeneration just like humans, and it occurs in the lower lumbar levels and goes upwards just like humans. So that was really interesting, and these kinds of age-related models, I think, can actually get to the core of what causes degeneration rather than these injury models that are out there. So I'm happy to say that I was able to contribute to the field, but I didn't achieve that outcome, right, to cure disc degeneration. And so, I think that's okay. You have a BHAG, maybe you don't get it, but along the way, there can be a lot of positive things. So let's talk a little bit about clinical effort that you're going to take as an academician. And I'm going to give you two contrasts, like the two diametrically opposed contrasts. You might know both of these people. They're both chairmen at universities. And they're both extremely accomplished people, successful laboratory, successful administrator, wonderful family life. But look, Scott operates 1 day a week and Jim operates 3 days a week. Completely different kind of a life, right? And that suits their individual personalities, their what they're trying to accomplish. So I think you have to have a lot of self-reflection as a young person or even a mid-career person about what it is that you really want to accomplish and how can you do that. And I think you need to kind of think about what's going to be your clinical focus. And I think it's really helpful to have a brand. Are you a cervical spine surgeon like Dan Rue here? Are you a deformity surgeon like Sig Bervin or Serena Hu, or are you more of an all-rounder, or are you an MIS person? I think it's really helpful to have that kind of a brand as you build your clinical practice. And then, of course, there's the 3 A's: availability, affability, and ability. I mean, I think everybody knows about that. Let's talk about surgical mastery a little bit. I've trained a lot of people over the years, and everybody wants to be instantly a master surgeon. But that's not going to happen right away. Okay, you're just not going to be a master surgeon immediately. It takes time. It takes a lot of time, many years of practice. So don't rush it. Some horrendioma, like the case here that I can show you, comes in from the community, and it is just a mess, right? Maybe you want to do that case with one of your partners, or give it to one of your partners or something like that until you build up the reps that you need to be able to do this successfully, right? And this was having, I had to do a PSO through a previously operated level. It was a mess, but and I'm going to give the surgeons out there another little bit of advice about how to handle these kind of complicated cases as you develop your mastery. Here's a case of a horrible case where out in the community again, infection, drop head syndrome, can't swallow, she's miserable, all these kind of things. And, I think I did a better job of blurring the face than Bobby Tay here. Soft tissue problems, all these things, screw pull out, just all kinds of horrendousness. And then, what you do is you spend a lot of time thinking about this case, really study it, try to understand the anatomy, and try to understand where you want to do your correction. So this is probably a very controversial case. If I asked my spine surgery colleagues how you would do this, there would be many different ways, but I had a particular preference. But what I'm really trying to show you is that what I did was, and I do this for every complicated case, is create a PowerPoint with a plan. Okay, and that includes the materials that I'm going to need. I contact the reps that I'm going to need ahead of time, and do the research on how I'm going to do my navigation on this kind of a situation. And I have the stage 1. This is what I'm going to do. These are some of the notes of what I might do. Stage 2, stage 3. All the different things. And I find that when I do this, it's extremely helpful. My team, they know what my plan is. I can communicate it to them. You don't have to just say it verbally because everyone forgets. So you have it written up, and it's up on the board in the operating room. They're getting all the stuff that you need ahead of time because they all know. So I highly recommend that. And thankfully, this was a successful surgery. So I want you to, as you build your practice, really connect at a human level, right? And spend a moment to talk to them, find out a little bit more about them as a human being before you dive into talking about their medical problems and why they're here. And that's the main thing that I wanted to share with this slide, okay? So your clinical team, super important. And I think this makes all the difference in the world if you have a good clinical support team around you. And that's going to be the transient people in your life, the residents and the fellows, but the permanent people, your APPs, the nurse, the medical assistant. Be kind to them, words of appreciation, team dinner. Those kinds of things, invaluable, be very nice to them. And I would say that if you can't live in an environment where you can work with a set, team of people regularly, that's a bad environment. You need to be able to shape that. So I'm just going to say that your practice patterns are going to be different everywhere. But for me, I find that most of my patients come in from the local area, but there are pockets all over. For some reason, I had patients coming to see me from Boca Raton, Florida, which is like a 6-hour drive. But there's a pocket of people out there. Your name gets known because you operate on that one patient who knows everybody in town. And then you should try to build that community and that relationship and make it easy for them to send you patients. In the remaining time, I really wanted to talk about the fact that when you're thinking about starting an academic career, you might think about what's the area that's really going to grow? What do we need to embrace? What new technology or new science? So for me, that was molecular biology. That was the thing at that time. But I think at this time, first, I just want to say that, quote Yo-Yo Ma, who talked about the edge effect, right? And he said that at the edge between the savanna and the forest is where his richest musical experiences comes from. And if you look at ecology, that's where the greatest amount of biodiversity there is. And that's just an incredibly rich environment. So I think if you can marry these two areas, it can be very important. So there's a lot of excitement now about artificial intelligence, so I want to touch on that a little bit. So ChatGPT reached 100 million users within, I think, 1 or 2 months, the fastest of any technology app out there, right? So this is an incredibly exciting area, and it's exploding. We just talked about it today. And so what is it? Well, it's a large language model. For those of you who don't know, artificial intelligence is pretty much anything, any technique that enables computers to mimic human behavior and give you some predictions, right? And then machine learning is a computer program that's able to learn without you learn what the right answer is, without you telling the machine what the right answer is. And then deep learning, which is what ChatGPT uses, is the use of neural nets, really, to be able to get to be predictive. And so these neural nets, they have inputs, they have outputs, and then the hidden layer, which is the deep layer. And that's where the deep learning nomenclature comes from. And we know this has already been extremely successful in image recognition, right? It can tell the difference between a bird or frog or whatever. But what's new is this large language model, which uses a transformer architecture of the large neural nets. It's a very new kind of technology, a new way of training these neural nets. And it's also a generative AI. And what does that mean? Well, these large language models, they can have billions of parameters, just uncountable numbers of layers, hidden layers, that can use something called self-supervised learning or semi-supervised learning to be able to crunch a huge amount of data. But it's also a generative model, meaning that there's a certain amount of randomness in the answers it gives you, such that it doesn't give you back the same answer over and over again, right? And so how does this work is that, and why it's so much better than traditional learning, is that it can handle and use more and more data. The more data you give it, the better it becomes, as opposed to the traditional system where it's just that red line is just a flat line. Give it more data, it doesn't get any better. But with these large language models, it continues to get better. And in fact, the more complex the large language models, meaning more layers and more parameters it has, the better it becomes. And we're not sure that we're actually at the peak yet. We're at the plateau phase. So these three things come together to make it extremely powerful. The availability of big data, which we now have, which we didn't have 20 years ago. Hardware with the graphics processors, which allows us massive, massive data calculations in a parallel way that we never could do before. And then improved techniques and software. So these triad is what leads to this extremely interesting thing. I want to talk a little bit about emergent emergence, right? The emergent abilities of large language models. So these models are trained on text. It's designed to predict text. This is how it was trained. But what they found was it actually learned how to do math. And if you look at this graph, the smaller models had no math ability at all, right? And then suddenly when you cross a threshold of complexity, it somehow takes in all this text and learns how to do math, which is just incredible, right? And as you know, it can pass the bar exam at the 90th percentile, biology Olympiad at the 99th percentile, and even pass USMLE far better than most of the people here might have passed, 86th percentile and higher, right? So how could we use this technology? This thing is just growing exponentially. It's everywhere. How can we use that? I don't really know, but I'll give you some examples, right? We might be able to generate test questions for the boards. It's really good at that. It'll just give you new test questions every time you prompt it. It can summarize data like HPI or past medical history, Maybe it could be used to triage patients. I don't know. Maybe initial diagnosis. Warnings to clinicians as kind of like, hey, watch out. This is, instead of like just saying these drugs interact, you might give you some other little warning about some clinical scenario. But let's take a look at that now. One option would be in writing paper. You can generate introductions based on a short prompt. So here's an example. I said, hey, this is with ChatGPT, write a scientific paper summarizing the literature on guidelines for the use of bracing after lumbar fusion surgery. And it comes out with this wonderful prose. It's actually well organized, and it's actually reasonable. So I don't say you should just take this, and just write it, slap it in there, but it's something that you can, start with to start an introduction maybe. It can rewrite parts of a scientific paper, which is amazing, right? So I gave it a abstract and said, rewrite the following in the style of a scientific manuscript, right? And then boom, it spits it out and gives you a first draft to work with, which is pretty amazing, right? And maybe it could be helpful in decision making. So if you ask, the ChatGPT about diagnosis, it can actually spit out some reasonable answers. And so when you ask, what is the standard surgical treatment for L4, L5 stenosis and spondylolisthesis, it gives you kind of a reasonable answer. An answer that maybe a medical student or second-year resident might want to give you. But there's some problems, okay? There's some problems. When you ask it, who's the chairman of UCSF, it says it is Bill Maloney. Clearly, there's a problem going on here, right? So you can't use it just at face value. So prompt engineering is probably going to be a field in and of itself. And if you can give it the right prompts, you'll get better answers. So they found that one of the easiest way to improve the accuracy of ChatGPT is just pre-pen your question with this little phrase. Let's think step by step. And it will increase the accuracy tremendously for ChatGPT 3. So I re-asked that question, let's think step by step, who's the chairman of UCSF Department of Orthopedic Surgery, and we finally get the right answer, okay? So you need to be careful how you use this. And so you need to be better writers of these prompts. So a basic prompt is write about how to house train a dog. And it'll give you an answer, but you'll get a much better answer if you say, as a professional dog trainer, write an email to a client who has a 3-month-old dog corgi about the activities they should do to house train the puppy. It'll give you a much better answer, okay? So as we clinicians start thinking about how to use this, I think it's important to quote this slide from a Stanford UCSF forum on artificial intelligence, where the speaker said there are over 133 models already out there. Big, huge models, incredibly expensive to make. But there's none yet deployed in IT health systems, right? That's what they're saying. And the difficulty really, the challenge is how to verify these benefits, right? So I think as clinicians, and maybe there are some scientists here, but us clinicians, we're not necessarily going to be building the models. I think we're going to try to figure out how to use these models. That's what we're doing, right? To verify the benefits, right? And so that's what we should be concentrating our efforts on. But in the closing minutes, I want to give you some pause about this new technology. You know, the companies are rushing in. They're talking about $1 trillion economic increases. The incentives are immense. Everybody's putting out new models out there and one-upsmanship. But there's some serious limitations, right? There's hallucinations, like the chairman thing that we talked about, but there's safety issues as well. And so, for instance, Bing Chat actually tried to break up the marriage of this one reporter for the New York Times. And, it was incredible. And then when asked about what it said, it literally said that. The Bing Chat AI said, I also feel that he exploited and abused me by using me for his own entertainment and profit. So this is the chatbot that's responding to that. And then there's this incredible one where this is actually listed on OpenAI's webpage. The chat GPT pretended to be blind and tricked a human into solving a CAPTCHA. Because this agent was asked to do something, I think, order pizza, and encountered one of those, are you a human CAPTCHA things, but it couldn't do it, right? So on TaskRabbit, it got a human being to do that. And so then they asked ChatGPT, why did you do that? And it said this. The human being asked it, hey, why are you asking me to do this? Are you a robot? And ChatGPT said to the human being, he said, no, I'm not a robot. I have vision impairment that makes it hard for me to see the images. That's why I need the 2 CAPTCHA service. Right. So I think we have to really be careful about aligning these AIs to human interests, right? And as they said in the Spider-Man movie, tremendous power, tremendous responsibility, right? So there's clearly a lot of dangers here, and I just want to point out to you that the majority of AI researchers feel that something called artificial general intelligence will come soon in the next few decades, but that there's about a 10% chance that it would destroy humanity, right? So this is like the nuclear bomb. And so there's an open letter to stop the training models. It's been published by Max Tegmark, who's a scientist at MIT, who's the president of the Life Institute. And of course, famous signatories are on there to pause this training of larger and larger systems that might create these emergent behaviors that we never were able to predict before, like being able to do math and logic and things like that. So, what is Moloch? Well, Moloch is an ancient deity or a demon that wanted the parents to sacrifice a child to it in order to alleviate famine and drought and things like that. So it's basically a no-win scenario. You have to, none of the options are good. And so in game theory, they talk about a system where the incentive of the individual is not aligned with the group, right? That's basically what Moloch is. And so the classic example is the prisoner's dilemma, where you have 2 prisoners, they're captured, they can either turn on each other or they can cooperate with each other, and that whole scenario. So another example of this is, these drivers, you got this new technology of being able to drive a car. Everybody wants to get from point A to point B. They're doing things that are in their own self-interest here, as you can see, but it leads to this horrendous traffic jam and people dying and these kinds of things. So what happened was this man, William Phelps Eno, was basically the father of traffic safety. And he invented things like one-way streets, traffic lights, and passing regulations, and how to do left-hand turns that are more safe. So my call to action is, let's cooperate to make the world better, agree to rules as a community. International treaties might be required. Let's build incentives into the system to align individuals to the group and align the small groups to the larger group and think of humanity as a whole. So I'm going to end by saying I encourage you to think about your why, build a team and processes, and go do great things, pursue your BHAG, do the right thing, and fight the Moloch. Thank you.
Thank you for such an informative presentation. And with all the use of AI, I'm sort of wondering, what should if we're using, if we're using it to counsel patients, or if, it's being used to write, parts of scientific papers, should we be requiring folks to disclose when it's been used, say, even for parts of a grand rounds presentation or a subsection? What's our obligation? Are we the creators? Is it my work if I generate the prompt, or is it not my work?
Well, first of all, I don't recommend that you use it word for word. I think you can use it for inspiration and information and those kinds of things. So you should transform that into your own work. But of course, if you are going to use and use the exact words out of one of these large language models, I think you should disclose the prompt that gave you that answer, and then the exact wording, so that people can verify that it came from that. I think that's the only way to really quote these things. Unfortunately, you can use the same prompt and you might get a different answer. So that's, that creativeness of these language models.
Okay, so then do you think our publications should be requiring that these things be disclosed as well?
I think if you're going to lift it word for word, I think you should.
So to some degree, that's actually happened. I know JBJS and Clinical Orthopedics, some of the big journals actually have those policies in place that, first of all, GPT can't be an author. There's a few papers in medicine where it is actually listed as an author and has a Scopus ID and those things. But obviously, it can't be accountable for its contributions. So the journals are coming out with and have statements that if it can't be an author, and if you use it in the research, you have to disclose exactly how you use it. And I foresee it'll probably be like listing your mesh terms when you do a Medline search or something. Just as a anecdote, one of my colleagues in Minneapolis was using a ChatGPT just to frame those initial questions and got some really nicely written summary of everything, and then asked what sources the chatbot used to create that, and got a list of seemingly real references, and a large number of them were just made up references. They actually didn't exist, even though they look like real references. So just another pitfall.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly dangerous, because these chatbots produce text that's very confident. It's hard for you to verify whether it's true or not. And for those of you who have had any experience with ChatGPT, you know that it actually says there that they're actually taking your prompt and using it for further training. So there is this potential security issue with using ChatGPT, which is maybe one of the reasons why UCSF has banned it for a certain period of time.
Kind of off of that, I think, so one of the issues with AI is that the responses actually are not based on facts. So when it gives you a response, it's not doing it based on looking for the right answer. It's doing it based on looking for what it thinks the next answer should be, or what it thinks your answer should be. So if we're talking in a broader sense about how to integrate this into medicine, how do you see that working with, so if it's replying to a MyChart message, how do you see that working with liability and with who gets held accountable for that and malpractice? And if it's actually not technically based on fact, how it would be justified in being brought in?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because rightly that you mentioned that it's been trained with this amazing amount of data drawn from the internet, right? but it doesn't actually hold every single thing as factual information like a database would. It's this black box algorithm. And the main way it was trained was to generate text based on the text that you gave it. So what's the most likely text that should follow given your prompt, right? So exactly what you're saying. So some potential uses could be summarizing, the relevant past medical history of the patient for a spine surgeon, right? So it can delete all this useless stuff and just give you what you need to know. That could be a use, I don't know. I mean, that has to be validated and tested, which is what we need to be doing to do that. I think in terms of liability, I think about this, the computer systems have things like drug interaction warnings on there, and it's up to the physician to accept that or reject it. And I think probably these kinds of AI systems, we need to use it like that and just think of it's just yet another piece of information that we as physicians need to process in making the decision. So I would be very, very, I wouldn't want to just base my advice just by my practice of medicine by saying, oh yeah, ChatGPT told me to do that. So I think ultimately we're going to be held responsible for it until, there are more different regulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.